The storm hit without warning, transforming the forest trail into a treacherous maze of mud and fallen branches. Rain pounded the canopy with such force that visibility dropped to mere feet, and lightning split the darkening sky in jagged tiers of white fire. A young man stumbled through the deluge, his pack of furs weighing him down, his rifle wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the water, searching desperately for any kind of shelter before hypothermia claimed him. He had heard stories about fur trappers found frozen in these mountains, their bodies discovered months later by other travelers, and he had no intention of becoming another cautionary tale whispered around winter fires. What he could not know was that the abandoned trading post he would find, and the two women already sheltering there, would force him into a situation where pretending to sleep would reveal truths that could start a war or prevent one, and his next decision would echo through these mountains for generations. If stories of trust and survival in impossible situations speak to you, consider subscribing to see how courage emerges in the most unexpected moments. The fur trapping season of 1742 had been disappointing for most men working the Berkshire Mountain territories. Beaver populations had declined after years of aggressive hunting, and competition between trappers had grown fierce and sometimes violent. The young man fighting through the storm had spent 3 weeks in the high country with minimal success, managing to collect only a modest bundle of pelts that would barely cover supplies and leave little profit. His name was Daniel, 22 years old, son of a failed merchant who had sent him west to seek fortune in the wilderness trade when their Boston shop collapsed under debt. Daniel had no particular skills that suited him for this brutal profession. He was neither an expert woodsman nor a natural hunter, and his first 2 seasons had been marked by near starvation, dangerous encounters with both animals and hostile traders, and a growing realization that the romantic vision of frontier life bore little resemblance to its harsh reality. Yet he persisted because he had nowhere else to go, no family willing to take him in, no prospect in the crowded coastal settlements where competition for every position left young men like him scrambling for scraps. The storm had caught him 5 miles from the nearest established camp, and his options had narrowed to finding shelter immediately or risking serious illness in the cold rain that soaked through his leather clothing despite its treatment with animal fat. Through the gray curtain of water, he spotted the outline of a structure that made his heart leap with relief. An old trading post, abandoned years ago when the man who built it was killed in a dispute over territory, stood partially collapsed but still offering walls and a roof over most of its interior. Daniel approached cautiously, knowing that such places sometimes house dangerous men fleeing colonial justice or hostile warriors, using them as temporary camps. He paused outside, listening for voices or movement, hearing only the roar of rain on the remaining roof sections. Satisfied that the structure appeared empty, he pushed through the sagging door into the dim interior, grateful beyond words to escape the storm's fury. The space smelled of rot and animal occupation, but one corner remained relatively dry, and someone had left a stone fire ring that still contained old ashes. He quickly set about making the space habitable, clearing debris from the driest corner and gathering wood from the covered sections where rain had not yet penetrated. His hands shook from cold as he worked, and he knew he needed fire soon or the hypothermia he had been staving off would overwhelm him. Using his precious dry tinder and flint, he coaxed a small flame to life, feeding it carefully until it grew strong enough to accept slightly damp wood. The warmth felt like salvation, and he stripped off his wet outer layers to hang them near the flames. As darkness fell outside and the storm continued its assault, Daniel began to relax slightly. He had food in his pack, a fire for warmth, and walls to block the wind. Tomorrow he would continue toward the trading settlement, where he could sell his furs and resupply before heading back into mountains for one more attempt before winter made trapping impossible. He chewed on dried venison and allowed himself to imagine that perhaps his luck was finally turning, that this season might yet prove profitable enough to justify another year in this unforgiving profession. The door burst open with a crash that sent Daniel scrambling for his rifle, his heart hammering with sudden fear. 2 figures rushed inside, struggling to close the door against the wind, both thoroughly soaked and breathing hard from exertion. In the firelight, Daniel saw they were women, young, dressed in a mixture of native deerskin and trade cloth, their long dark hair plastered to their heads by rain. They froze when they noticed him, their eyes widening with alarm, and for several seconds, The three strangers simply stared at each other across the small space. Daniel lowered his rifle slowly, tried to appear non-threatening despite his racing pulse. The women spoke rapidly to each other in a language he did not understand, clearly debating their options. He recognized the cadence and some sounds as similar to Mohican dialects he had occasionally heard at trading posts, though he knew none of the actual words. The taller of the two women finally addressed him in heavily accented English, asking permission to share the shelter and promising they meant no harm. Something in her voice, perhaps the exhaustion or the genuine fear in her eyes, made Daniel nod agreement. He gestured toward the opposite side of the fire, indicating they were welcome to its warmth. The women moved cautiously, keeping distance between themselves and the armed white man, clearly as uncertain of this arrangement as he was. They removed their own wet outer garments and hung them to dry, revealing that both carried knives at their belts in small packs that suggested they were traveling light and fast. The taller woman introduced herself as Kimmy and her companion as Ayana, explaining they were sisters returning to their village after visiting relatives in a settlement 2 days north. The storm had caught them exposed on the trail, and they had remembered this old structure from previous travels. Her English was functional but limited, and she seemed to choose each word with care, watching Daniel's reactions closely as if gauging his trustworthiness. Daniel gave his own name and explained his presence briefly, mentioning nothing about his failures or desperation, presenting himself simply as a trapper waiting out the storm. He offered to share his food, which the sisters accepted with cautious gratitude. They ate in uncomfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, the storm continuing to rage outside. Daniel found himself studying the women when he thought they were not looking, noting the quality of their clothing and the bearing that suggested they were not ordinary travelers, but people of some status within their community. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, an uneasy truce settled over the small shelter. Kimmy and Ayana spoke occasionally to each other in low voices, their language flowed with sounds that Daniel found both beautiful and completely incomprehensible. He noticed how protective the older sister seemed to the younger, how she positioned herself between Ayana and him, how her hand never strayed far from the knife at her belt. These were women who had learned caution through experience, who understood that vulnerability in the wilderness could prove fatal. Daniel's exhaustion began to overwhelm his wariness. 3 weeks of hard travel, minimal sleep, and constant vigilance had drained his reserves completely. The warmth of the fire, the relative safety of walls around him, and the simple presence of other humans after so much solitude combined to make his eyelids impossibly heavy. He tried to fight it, tried to stay alert, but his body demanded rest. He stretched out on his bedroll, positioning himself so he could theoretically see both women and the door, though he knew if they intended harm, he would be vulnerable while sleeping. But as sleep began to claim him, some instinct made Daniel hesitate. Something about the sisters troubled him in ways he could not articulate. They seemed too purposeful, too focused, as if traveling through a dangerous storm was not merely unfortunate timing, but part of a deliberate plan. Their packs were too small for a casual visit to relatives, and they had arrived with an urgency that suggested fleeing rather than simply seeking shelter. The way they periodically glanced toward the door implied they expected pursuit or feared discovery. Daniel made a calculated decision. He closed his eyes and regulated his breathing to mimic sleep, letting his body go slack while keeping his mind alert. It was a technique he had learned during his first season when sharing camps with other trappers he did not fully trust, a way to observe without being observed, to gather information without revealing his awareness. Within minutes, the sisters began speaking more freely, their voices still low but less guarded, apparently convinced the white trapper had fallen into genuine slumber. At first, their conversation meant nothing to Daniel, just the flowing sounds of their native tongue, discussing matters he could not comprehend. But then Kimmy switched to English, speaking quietly to her sister in a language they both clearly understood reasonably well. Perhaps she wanted to practice, or perhaps some of what they needed to discuss required English words for concepts that had no equivalent in Mohican. Whatever the reason, her choice gave Daniel access to information that made his blood run cold. Kimmy spoke of a raid being planned, white settlers preparing to attack their village under the pretense of retaliation for theft that had never occurred. She mentioned a militia captain named Morrison who convinced local colonial authorities that the Mohican community hidden in these mountains posed a threat, that they were harboring French sympathizers and needed to be eliminated before they could coordinate with enemy forces. The raid was scheduled for 3 days hence, timed to coincide with a harvest celebration when the entire village would be gathered together and vulnerable. Daniel's heart hammered so loudly he feared they would hear it. He kept his breathing steady through sheer force of will, his mind racing with the implications of what he was hearing. The sisters had learned of this plan from a sympathetic trader who had overheard the militia organizing, and they were racing back to warn their people, so the village could be evacuated before the attack arrived. Time was desperately short, and the storm had cost them precious hours they could not afford to lose. Ayana spoke then, her English more broken than her sister's, but still comprehensible. She expressed fear that they would not reach the village in time, that even if they did, convincing everyone to abandon their homes and flee into mountains before winter would be nearly impossible. Many of the elders would resist leaving, arguing that they had committed no crimes and should not be driven from land they had occupied for generations. The younger warriors would want to stay and fight, believing their knowledge of the terrain gave them advantage over clumsy colonial militia. Kimmy's response carried the weight of terrible certainty. She had seen what happened when native villages tried to stand against colonial forces, had witnessed the massacres that resulted when resistance was offered. Their only chance was flight, scattering into the wilderness and reforming elsewhere, abandoning everything they had built to preserve the lives that mattered more than structures or possessions. But first they had to reach the village, had to deliver the warning, and the storm made speed impossible. Then Ayana said something that made Daniel's breath catch despite his effort to maintain his deception. She mentioned the sleeping trapper, wondering if he could be trusted, if he might help them reach the village faster by guiding them through trails he might know as a man who worked these mountains. Kimmy's response was sharp and immediate. No white man could be trusted with this information, she insisted. Even if this particular trapper seemed harmless, revealing their situation would put their entire people at risk. If he was sympathetic to colonial interests, he might try to stop them or alert the militia. If he was simply indifferent, he might mention their meeting to others who would piece together the implications. The sisters debated in urgent whispers, weighing impossible options. They could wait for the storm to pass and travel at maximum speed, but that meant losing another half day at minimum. They could attempt to travel through the storm, but the darkness and conditions made that suicidal, particularly given how easy it would be to become lost or injured. They could kill the sleeping trapper to ensure his silence, but both sisters rejected that option immediately. Kimmy stating firmly that murdering an innocent man contradicted everything their people believed, that becoming killers to prevent killing made no moral sense. Daniel lay frozen, processing this conversation that had revealed a conspiracy of violence and put him in an impossible position. Every instinct screamed at him to continue his deception, to say nothing, to let the sisters leave in the morning and pretend he had heard nothing of their desperate mission. Getting involved in conflict between settlers and natives was the fastest way to end up dead, caught between forces that would show no mercy to anyone perceived as aiding the enemy. He had his own survival to consider, his own future, and throwing that away for strangers made no practical sense whatsoever. Yet he could not stop thinking about what Kimmy had described. A massacre planned against people who had committed no crime. Families murdered in their homes during a harvest celebration. Children killed alongside their parents because a militia captain wanted to claim native land or simply hated them for existing. Daniel had heard stories of such attacks, had listened to trappers and traders describe finding burned villages and bodies left unburied, and had always told himself those situations were more complicated than they appeared, that surely the natives had done something to provoke such responses. But listening to Kimmy's fear and Ayana's desperation, hearing their very human terror at what approached their community, Daniel could no longer maintain that comfortable distance. These were not abstract natives existing in stories, but real women trying to save real people from real violence. The fact that he understood their language was pure accident, but that accident had given him knowledge that came with responsibility. Pretending he did not know, allowing events to unfold when he had power to intervene, made him complicit in whatever followed. The storm continued battering the shelter, rain drumming steadily on the roof, wind howling through gaps in the walls. The fire burned low, needing more wood, but none of them moved to feed it. The sisters had fallen silent, lost in their own troubled thoughts, occasionally glancing at Daniel's supposedly sleeping form. He knew he had to make a decision soon. That morning would come and the sisters would leave, and whatever choice he made now would define who he was in ways he could not take back. Daniel thought about his father, the failed merchant who had always emphasized honor over profit, who had lost everything because he refused to cheat customers even when cheating would have saved the business. He thought about the values he had been taught as a child, about treating others as you wish to be treated, about standing against injustice even when standing had costs. Those lessons had seemed naive and impractical when he entered the brutal world of frontier survival, but now they returned with unexpected force. Daniel opened his eyes slowly, deliberately, making sure the movement was visible in the firelight. Kimmy and Ayana jerked to attention immediately, their hands moving instinctively toward their knives, their bodies tensing for potential conflict. Daniel raised both hands in a peaceful gesture, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening, and spoke in a quiet voice that he hoped conveyed sincerity rather than danger. He told them he had heard everything, that he understood English was not their first language, and they had not realized how clearly their words carried in the small space. The color drained from Kimmy's face. Her hand gripped her knife handle, and Daniel saw the terrible calculation happen behind her eyes, the weighing of options that included violence as a necessary evil to protect her people. He spoke quickly, desperate to prevent the situation from escalating into bloodshed that would help no one. He told them he wanted to help, that what he had overheard about the planned raid horrified him, that he had knowledge of these mountains that could indeed help them reach their village faster and by routes the militia would not know. Ayana said something sharp in Mohican, clearly arguing they should not trust him, that this was obviously a trap. Kimmy held up a hand to silence her sister, studying Daniel with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as if she could see through any deception straight into his actual intentions. She asked him why a white trapper would risk himself for natives he did not know, what possible motivation he could have for getting involved in a conflict that could get him killed by his own people. Daniel struggled to articulate an answer that made sense even to himself. He explained haltingly that he had no loyalty to militia captains or colonial authorities, that he was himself an outsider to settler society, barely surviving on his margins. He said that the idea of families murdered during a celebration turned his stomach, that he could not live with himself if he had the power to prevent such horror and chose inaction instead. His words sounded inadequate even as he spoke them, too idealistic for the harsh realities they all faced. But they were the truth and he had nothing else to offer. Kimmy and Ayana held a rapid conversation in their own language, voices rising occasionally with emotion before dropping back to urgent whispers. Daniel waited, understanding that his fate hung in this moment, that these women could easily decide he was too dangerous to trust and too dangerous to leave alive. The knife at Kimmy's belt was well used, and he had no doubt both sisters knew how to employ their weapons with deadly efficiency. He had made himself vulnerable by revealing his knowledge, and now he had to live or die based on their judgment of his character. Finally, Kimmy turned back to him and spoke with careful deliberation. She said they would accept his help, but with conditions. If he betrayed them or showed any sign of deception, they would kill him without hesitation regardless of consequences. If his guidance proved false or deliberately misleading, they would assume the worst and act accordingly. But if he proved trustworthy, if he genuinely helped them reach their village in time to save lives, their people would remember and honor that assistance in ways that could benefit him for the rest of his life. Daniel agreed immediately, relief flooding through him despite the very real threat she had outlined. They spent the next hour planning their route, with Daniel describing trails he had learned during his time trapping these mountains. He knew a path that cut through a narrow valley and reduced the travel time by almost a full day, dangerous in places, but manageable for experienced travelers. The militia would likely take the main approaches, expecting no warning and no resistance, which meant the back routes would be clear. The storm finally began to ease before dawn, the rain diminishing to a steady drizzle, and the wind losing its violent intensity. As gray light filtered through the clouds, the three travelers prepared to leave. Daniel packed his furs and gear with efficient movements born of long practice, aware that he was abandoning his original plan to sell pelts at the trading post, likely sacrificing what little profit this season would have brought. The sisters gathered their own minimal belongings, checking their weapons and tightening the straps on their packs. They moved out into the wet morning, Daniel leading the way along trails that few white men knew existed. The sisters followed with the silent grace of people who had spent their entire lives in these forests, their footsteps barely audible even on muddy ground. They traveled at a punishing pace, stopping only briefly to drink from streams and eat small amounts of dried food, without bothering to build fires that would slow them down. Daniel's body protested the exertion after so many days of hard trapping work, but he pushed through fatigue, understanding that lives depended on their speed. As they traveled, Kimmy began to open up slightly, sharing information about her village and people. She explained they were one of the last independent Mohican communities, having retreated deep into these mountains decades ago to escape the encroaching colonial settlements. They numbered perhaps 200 souls, a mixture of families that had joined together from scattered bands, trying to maintain their traditional ways while the world around them transformed into something unrecognizable. They traded peacefully with few trusted settlers, avoided conflict whenever possible, and asked only to be left alone to live according to their ancestors' customs. The militia captain organized a raid. This man Morrison that Kimmy had mentioned apparently viewed their peaceful existence as an insult and a threat. He wanted their land for timber and farming, wanted to establish his own settlement in this region, and saw the native presence as an obstacle to be eliminated. He had fabricated stories about thefts and French sympathies, playing on the fears and prejudices of colonial authorities who needed little convincing that natives represented danger. The fact that his accusations had no basis in reality mattered less than his political connections, and the widespread assumption that native claims to land were invalid regardless of centuries of occupation. Daniel listened with growing anger, recognizing the injustice, but also understanding how common such situations had become throughout the colonies. Native peoples were being systematically pushed westward, their populations decimated by disease and violence, their cultures destroyed through deliberate policies that treated them as obstacles rather than humans with rights. He had known this intellectually, but had never confronted it so directly, had never been forced to choose sides in such a clear-cut manner. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley where smoke from cooking fires rose from a cluster of dwellings built in traditional Mohican style, alongside some European-influenced structures. The village looked peaceful, people moving about their daily tasks, children playing near the stream that ran through the center of the settlement, completely unaware of the violence approaching them. Kimmy's breath caught at the sight, relief and fear mixing on her face as she realized they had made it in time, but now faced the difficult task of convincing her people to abandon everything. They descended rapidly, and Daniel found himself the subject of intense scrutiny as they entered the village. Warriors approached with weapons ready, demanding explanations in harsh voices, clearly suspicious of a white man being brought into their hidden community. Kimmy spoke rapidly in Mohican, gesturing emphatically, and Daniel caught his own name several times along with what sounded like urgent pleas for trust. An older man who appeared to be a leader or elder listened carefully, his weathered face grave, his eyes moving between Kimmy and Daniel with sharp assessment. Kimmy switched to English, apparently wanting Daniel to hear and confirm her account. She explained everything, from discovering the planned raid to encountering him in the shelter to his offer of help despite the risks to himself. She emphasized that without his guidance, they would not have arrived in time, that his knowledge of the trails had saved perhaps a full day of travel. The elder listened without interruption, then addressed Daniel directly in surprisingly fluent English, asking him why a colonial trapper would betray his own people to help natives he did not know. Daniel repeated what he had told the sisters, adding that he considered Morrison's planned attack to be murder rather than legitimate action, that he wanted no part of massacre regardless of who the victims were. He stated plainly that he believed the Mohican people had every right to live peacefully in these mountains, that their presence threatened no one, and that driving them out through violence was morally wrong even if colonial law might technically permit it. His words sounded bold in this context, standing in a native village surrounded by armed warriors, declaring allegiance to their cause over his own culture. The elder studied Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly and introduced himself as Matakomet, headman of his community and keeper of its collective wisdom. He called for a council meeting immediately, summoning the other leaders and respected elders to hear this urgent news and decide their response. Within minutes, the village center filled with people, their faces showing confusion and growing alarm as word spread about the threat approaching them. Daniel stood awkwardly to the side, acutely aware that he was likely the first white man many of these people had seen up close, certainly the first ever welcomed into their hidden refuge. Kimmy addressed the gathered community, her voice strong despite obvious exhaustion from the desperate journey. She detailed everything she had learned about Morrison's plans, the timing of the raid, the number of militia members involved, and the ruthless intentions behind the attack. She explained how Daniel had overheard their conversation and chosen to help rather than ignore or exploit their vulnerability. Her account was met with mixed reactions, some nodding with grim acceptance, while others voiced angry disbelief that they should trust any white man with information so critical to their survival. The debate that followed was passionate and painful to witness. Younger warriors argued they should prepare defenses and fight, that running would only delay inevitable conflict and make them appear weak. They spoke of ancestors who had defended these lands with blood, of honor requiring them to stand their ground rather than flee like frightened rabbits. Several elders countered that courage without wisdom was simply suicide, that fighting a well-armed militia with superior numbers would result in total annihilation, that survival required strategic retreat even when it meant abandoning homes built with years of labor. Matacomet listened to all perspectives before speaking with authority that quieted the competing voices. He acknowledged the pain of abandonment, the injustice of being driven from land they had occupied peacefully, the temptation to stand and fight despite impossible odds. But he emphasized that their primary responsibility was preserving lives and culture, that dead warriors could not protect anyone, that scattered survivors could rebuild while massacred communities disappeared forever from history. He declared they would evacuate immediately, taking only what they could carry, and disperse into the deep mountains where militia could not easily follow. The decision made, the village transformed into organized chaos. Families packed essential items with practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time they had been forced to flee. Food stores were divided and distributed. Tools were gathered. Children were prepared for the difficult journey ahead. Daniel watched in awe as the entire community mobilized within hours, their coordination speaking to deep bonds and shared understanding of survival in a hostile world. No one complained or resisted despite the obvious hardship this displacement represented. Kimmy approached Daniel as preparations continued, her expression complex and difficult to read. She thanked him formally for his help, acknowledging that without his intervention, they would have arrived too late to organize this evacuation. But she also asked what he planned to do now, pointing out that he had made himself an enemy of the colonial authorities by aiding their escape, that Morrison would likely learn of his involvement and seek retribution. Daniel had not fully considered this consequence, had acted on impulse without thinking through the personal cost of his choice. Matacomet joined their conversation, offering Daniel sanctuary with their people if he wished it. He could travel with them into the mountains, learn their ways, become part of their community as others had done before when circumstances pushed white men beyond the boundaries of colonial society. It was a genuine offer, Daniel realized, not given lightly but extended because he had earned their trust through actions rather than words. The elder made clear this was no small thing, that accepting would mean leaving behind everything familiar and embracing a completely different way of life. Daniel considered carefully, understanding that this moment represented a true crossroads in his existence. He could return to the settlements, claim ignorance about the village's evacuation, and try to resume his failing career as a trapper. But Kimmy was right that Morrison would likely suspect his involvement, and even if direct evidence was lacking, suspicion alone could make his life dangerous and difficult. The alternative was joining these people, helping them establish a new community somewhere deeper in the wilderness, becoming in essence a refugee alongside them. The choice became clear as he looked around at families preparing for exile, at children being comforted by parents who had their own fear, at elders saying goodbye to homes they would never see again. These people were not abstractions or enemies, but humans facing catastrophe with dignity and courage. He had already committed himself by helping Kimmy and Ayana reach the village in time. Abandoning them now, after they had trusted him with their survival, felt like a betrayal he could not stomach. Daniel told Matacomet he would accept the offer, that he would travel with them and help however he could. The elder's face softened with what might have been approval or perhaps relief, and he clasped Daniel's shoulder in a gesture of welcome that felt more meaningful than any formal ceremony. Kimmy smiled genuinely for the first time since he had met her, and Ayanna, who had remained wary throughout, nodded with grudging respect. They were accepting him not as a white man doing them a favor, but as someone willing to share their fate, and that distinction mattered enormously. By nightfall, the village stood empty. Every structure remained intact. Fires still smoldered in hearths, but the people had vanished into the forest with ghost-like efficiency. Daniel traveled with them, learning quickly to move with their rhythm, to read the subtle signals they used to communicate without speaking, to understand the terrain through their experienced eyes. The militia would find nothing when they arrived except abandoned dwellings and cold trails that led nowhere, and Morrison's planned massacre would be thwarted not by violence but by strategic disappearance. The displaced community traveled for 3 days before Metacomet selected a new location, a hidden valley even more remote and defensible than their previous home. They began rebuilding immediately, constructing temporary shelters that would serve until proper dwellings could be erected. Daniel worked alongside everyone else, his hands blistering as he learned unfamiliar techniques, his body aching from unaccustomed labor, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He was no longer alone, no longer struggling merely to survive, but part of something larger than himself. Over the following months, Daniel became integrated into the community in ways that surprised him. Kimmy and Ayanna adopted him as an honorary brother, teaching him their language and customs with patient humor. Young warriors who had initially viewed him with suspicion began including him in hunting expeditions, impressed by his growing skills and willingness to learn. Elders shared stories and knowledge, gradually accepting him as someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting their culture. He learned that the Mohican people had been devastated not by inherent weakness, but by diseases they had no immunity against, by systematic dispossession of their lands, by deliberate policies designed to destroy their way of life. He learned about the sophisticated governance systems they had developed, the deep spiritual connection to these mountains that went back countless generations, the oral histories that preserved knowledge with remarkable accuracy across centuries. Everything he had been taught about native peoples being primitive or inferior revealed itself as propaganda designed to justify theft and violence. Word eventually reached them that Morrison had indeed led his militia to the abandoned village, finding it empty and flying into a rage at being denied his prize. He had apparently tried to track the refugees, but quickly lost their trail, his men lacking the skills to follow people who knew how to move through these forests without leaving obvious signs. The militia returned to the settlements with nothing to show for their efforts except wasted time and ammunition, and Morrison's reputation suffered as people questioned his judgment and the accusations that had motivated the raid. Daniel never returned to colonial society. He built a life within the Mohican community, eventually marrying one of Ayanna's closest friends and raising children who spoke both English and Mohican, who moved between worlds with an ease he had never imagined possible. He became a bridge of sorts, helping negotiate with a few traders and settlers willing to deal fairly with native peoples, using his knowledge of both cultures to facilitate understanding and prevent conflicts before they escalated into violence. Years later, when Daniel was himself an elder with silver threading through his hair, he would tell the story of that stormy night when he pretended to sleep and overheard words that changed his entire life. He spoke of the choice between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable responsibility, between protecting himself and protecting others, between maintaining the divisions his culture insisted upon and recognizing common humanity that transcended those artificial boundaries. He emphasized that his decision had not been heroic but simply human, that anyone confronted with knowledge of impending massacre faced the same moral imperative to act. The community he helped save went on to survive and eventually thrive in their hidden valley, maintaining their traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. They became known among other displaced native groups as a place of refuge and wisdom, somewhere that had successfully resisted annihilation not through violence, but through strategic thinking and unity. And Daniel's role in their preservation became part of their oral history, a story told to demonstrate that not all colonists were enemies, that individuals could choose differently than their societies demanded, that bridges between worlds could be built by those brave enough to cross them. Kimmy and Ayanna remained his closest friends throughout his life, the sisters who had initially debated whether to trust or kill him becoming the people who knew him most completely. They often laughed about that tense night in the abandoned trading post, about how a storm and pretended sleep had brought together three people who otherwise would never have met, about how small moments of courage could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or measure. In his final years, Daniel reflected on how different his life had become from what he had imagined as a young failed trapper struggling to survive. He had found not the wealth he originally sought, but something far more valuable. A community that valued him not for what he could produce or acquire, but for who he had chosen to be in a moment when choosing mattered. The furs he had abandoned to help the sisters reach their village in time had seemed like a sacrifice then, but revealed themselves as nothing compared to what he gained by making that choice. Thank you so much for watching the story of courage, trust, and the bridges we build when we choose humanity over division. If this tale moved you, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Hit the like button if you believe that understanding and compassion can triumph over prejudice and violence. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that we all have the power to change lives through our choices, that listening and acting with courage can create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Leave a comment telling us about a time when you had to choose between safety and doing what was right, or about moments when trusting someone unexpected changed your path. Your stories inspire us and build a community of people committed to choosing compassion over indifference. Until next time, remember that the person you choose to be in critical moments defines not just your own life, but potentially the lives of countless others who depend on your courage.